everyone. Welcome back from break. I hope you got a chance to stretch your legs and maybe grab a snack. Just take a deep breath. My name is Allison Cardona. I'm the California State Director for the UC Davis Koret Shelter Medicine Program, and I'm also your moderator for this session. In the spirit of inclusion, I want to describe that I am a Latina woman with curly, mid-length, darker hair with stripes of gray in it, and I'm wearing a red top. And today you've joined the Animal Welfare Short Talk, Homelessness 101 for Animal Welfare Professionals, promoting understanding for trauma-informed responses. This session will provide a broad landscape of the homelessness crisis, as well as foundational models and best practices that can be applied across animal welfare. Attendees will come away with concrete tools and action steps for supporting vulnerable and at-risk people through the lens of the human-animal bond. Our speaker is Heidi Marston. Heidi is comfortable getting into uncomfortable spaces. She has made an accomplished career and calling of solving complex problems related to socially vulnerable populations, including the unsheltered and military veterans. Merging her vast experience tackling systemic barriers to equity with a passion for animals promises to help make the world a better place for pets and the people they love. Prior to joining the PetSmart Charities team, Heidi served as Chief Executive Officer of the Los Angeles Homeless Services Authority, LAHSA, a joint powers authority for the city and county of Los Angeles, working alongside a staff of more than 600 to combat homelessness in Los Angeles, the epicenter of the staggering crisis. She logged more than a decade working for the federal government, where she held varied roles, including Special Assistant to the Secretary of the U.S. Department of Veteran Affairs and Director of Community Engagement and Reintegration at the Greater Los Angeles VA healthcare system. Heidi is a longtime foster pet parent, shelter volunteer, and advocate in the animal welfare space. She brings an unwavering commitment to social, racial, and economic justice, challenging herself and others to move past generalizations and address entrenched disparities that present barriers to success. Heidi was born and raised in Minnesota and is called Washington, D.C. and Los Angeles home, prior to moving to Phoenix, Arizona, where she lives with her partner and their two special needs rescue dogs, Kemper and Gatsby. Thank you for joining us and developing this great short talk, Heidi. Definitely looking forward to it and so appreciate it. And folks, if you want to drop your questions in the Q&A in Huba, we can answer them after Heidi's talk. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. And thank you everyone for joining. I am so excited to be here to talk with you about homelessness and some of the intersections that we see with the animal welfare space. So I'm just going to go ahead and share my screen. This is Homelessness 101 for Animal Welfare Professionals. And Allison, thank you for the lovely intro. And as Allison mentioned, this is just a little bit about me. So you see my two rescue dogs here. Gatsby is on my left. He is a blind and deaf Great Dane who is just pretty awesome. And then on the right is my rescue dog from the one of the Los Angeles shelters. His name is Kemper. And so they are a bundle of work and fun and teach me things every day, as I'm sure you all know all too well. And then this is just a quick overview of my background. As you heard from Allison, have a long history working in the federal government, working in homeless and housing services. Most recently was CEO of LA Homeless Services Authority. And then I am now at PetSmart Charities, where I'm the director of pet placement for the US and Canada. So I oversee all of the placement and adoption programs for charities. So it was a big jump over here, but it felt really good to take all of my exposure and experience from my prior roles and merge it with my passion for animals. So it feels like the perfect spot for me to be. So before we get started, I just want to encourage everybody. I want to walk us through a little bit of an imagination exercise, and you can close your eyes if you want to, or you can just walk through it with me. But I want everyone to imagine for a moment that if you lost your job or you lost your income, whatever that may be, whether it was an accident or injury or illness, how long, and you can just take notes to yourself here, but how long do you think that you could live without any other sources of income? So living off your savings, living where you are, and kind of sustaining yourself without that income, maybe a little bit of Social Security income, like $800 to $13 a month. How long could you actually keep your life as it is right now? And let's say the worst happens, right? And more income does not come in after 5 months, 6 months, a year, and you're forced to either downsize your housing, move somewhere that's more affordable because work and other incomes are not on the horizon right now. So how long could you potentially live somewhere else where your cost of living was lower, but you're still kind of surviving on that $800 to $1,300 a month and whatever you had saved? Once you finally got to a point where you could no longer live anywhere and pay rent because the cost of rent, maybe your medical bills and other things were piling up. And so you just weren't making enough money to fund all of the other living needs. How many family members and friends would you have that you could maybe stay with for a while to save up money or get back on your feet? And how long do you think you could stay with them? Maybe, a month, a couple months, 6 months, maybe a year, depending on the situation. And then how long realistically do you think it would take until you had no other option available to you but to sleep in your car or sleep outside because every other option was exhausted? My guess is that for most of us, that whole process would take a very long time. And that process is true for everybody who is experiencing homelessness across the country. Leading really to my first point here, and I think if there's one thing you take away, it's this. It's that being unhoused in America is not a character flaw. It's not an individual shortcoming. It's a grave policy and system failure. So today we're really going to dig into some of that, talk about what that actually means, but hopefully doing this through the lens of recognizing that any of us could be put in these positions at any time and how blessed, lucky, privileged, fortunate we are to not have to be going through a crisis like being unhoused. So a little bit of homelessness by the numbers. I tend to still use the California lens because that's where my recent role was, but also because California is the epicenter still of people experiencing homelessness across the country. So there are about 580,000 people experiencing homelessness across the country today. 1 in 4 of those people are in California. And you can see in LA County alone, about 69,000 individuals. These numbers are staggering. They continue to rise, and we're going to talk about some of those reasons, why they continue to rise, and some of the things that we can do in our roles in human services and animal welfare to support those folks. So one of my all-time favorite quotes is Edward Deming when he said, "Every system is perfectly designed to get the results that it gets." So if we don't like what we're seeing as an outcome, we need to change the system. So what you see here is a sketching, and I kind of like to think of big systems that are hard to pin down or hard to really figure out how they're feeding into the end problem. I think of them as like a shadow monster, and that's kind of what I tried to illustrate here. But a shadow monster is something that's elusive. It's hard to pin down. You know it's real, but you can't necessarily see the direct effects of it, kind of like an illness that's going untreated, and it becomes very pervasive. So it could be housing costs. It could be a system of systemic racism. It could be minimum wages, the foster care system. All of these systems are shadow monsters in their own right that are contributing to the housing crisis that we see today. And so really tackling it comes from zooming out and taking a larger lens of understanding the forces and the shadow monsters, if you will, that are pushing people into the position they're in. And I think too often we tend to take a position of blaming the individual and for not overcoming the systems that they are falling under. So hopefully this analogy makes sense to everybody. But here are some of the systems, and digging into it a little more, that are key contributors, and there's direct correlations between systems and changes in those systems and the number of people who become unhoused. So if we look at income as a first example, Congress hasn't raised the federal minimum wage from $7.25 since 2009, even though we know that cost of living has increased over 23%. On top of it, there are still over 1 million workers who make at or below minimum wage. And what that means with the cost of living the way that it is that nowhere in the US can you make minimum wage working 40 hours a week and afford a 2-bedroom apartment. So if you're a single parent, if you're a family that has 2 parents and you have a kid and you need a 2-bedroom, nowhere in the country can you make minimum wage and afford a 2-bedroom apartment. So that's showing us right there that the system that is in place is not working to get us the desired outcome. Another example are tenant protections and land use. So in California, I use California again as an example here, but it's not dissimilar to other parts of the country. There were laws passed in the 80s and 90s that made it easier to evict rent-controlled tenants, and it really limited local government's ability to enact rent control at all. So what we see is the cost of living is going up, the cost of rent, therefore, is going up with private landlords or public landlords, and wages are still stagnant and staying the same. So the gap is growing, and you see downstream effects of more people becoming housing insecure or losing their housing altogether. On the flip side, we're also, there's been significant disinvestment in affordable housing. So even when we had rent control with stronger protections, we also had affordable housing where the government would provide funding to actually create housing that was livable. But since 1979, which goes way back, Congress has reduced annual funding for what we call CDBG. It's a community development block grant by 77%. But what that really means is that 77% of the funding that has been going to cities and counties from the federal government that they can use to build housing that stays affordable and to preserve affordable homes has been cut. So the existing buildings have fallen into disrepair, and it's very, very difficult to build new affordable housing at scale given the gap and the need. And then, of course, the criminal justice system is another example of a system that is directly contributing, where we see things like mandatory minimums and truth in sentencing laws, which significantly increase the time that people are placed in prison or jail. And it is worth mentioning that people of color, if you are Black or brown, you are more likely not only to encounter the criminal justice system, but you're 4 times more likely to become unhoused. And so the systemic racism and institutional racism are huge contributors to the crisis that we see today. So hopefully we all agree that these systems that are in place are not working. And so what we have to do is redesign the system. So I really think of it as 3 pillars when we look at how do we address homelessness at scale. And the first pillar is prevention. So prevention is pretty simple. Stop anybody from becoming homeless in the first place. It is always going to be better in the long run from every aspect to keep people housed than it is to have them come into the system, have that impact and that trauma in their life and try to get back to where they were. But what we're seeing instead is that, again, this is a Los Angeles number from when I was there, but still holds true across the country. That every single day in LA County, 205 people moved from homelessness into homes. They signed a lease. They were no longer unhoused. They had the income. They had everything they needed. And at the same time, every single day, 225 people became homeless. So you can see the scales are imbalanced. And I use this graphic just because it's like a bathtub where the tub is overflowing, but we just keep pouring water into the tub without unclogging the drain first, right? So really thinking about at all costs, keeping people and preventing homelessness in the first place is going to be the best way to curb it at the end. And then again, going back to the initial practice that we did that's just kind of walked through how long would it actually take us, I think it's important that we note that homelessness really is, I call it a slow fade. It's not something that happens overnight for anybody. And by the time that you are at the point in your life where you have nowhere else to sleep but the sidewalk or outside or in your car, multiple systems have failed you multiple times. So what that means is that every safety net that was supposed to catch you didn't, which makes it harder, right, to trust the system, to go back into a place that has ultimately failed you, whether that's employment, healthcare, housing, We saw it a lot in the veteran population as well, where, veterans come back and might have physical challenges or some disabilities that prevents them from working. So these systems that are supposed to carry them are not working the way that they were told or promised that they would work. And therefore people are put in these impossible situations. So the first pillar, as I said, was prevention, stop people from becoming homeless in the first place. The second is also kind of simple, but rehousing, right? So when you do have somebody that becomes unhoused, we want to make it short, brief, and non-recurring so that we have a system in place to quickly support you back into housing. And a lot of this has to do with shifting our thinking from housing as something that people might need to prove themselves or deserve to housing as a human right. Which goes to the hierarchy of needs, which I'm sure you've all heard of the Maslow's hierarchy of needs. But when we look at the basic core of the hierarchy of needs, we see physiological and safety needs are at the base. And without those things, nothing else can come. And housing and shelter are captured under these physiological needs. So housing is a fundamental human right. And we need to have a system in place that when people do fall in, that they can quickly become rehoused and supported so that they don't keep falling further and further down. And then the third pillar, so prevention, rehoming when someone does become unhoused. And then the third is housing supply. We need enough houses for people to move into. And by housing, I mean an apartment, a unit, a townhome, whatever that is, but a permanent option for people to move into. However, right now across the country, there are 30 affordable units available for every 100 people who need them. So if you do become unhoused and you're looking for housing, it's like a really bad game of musical chairs to try to figure out how you can actually locate a unit that you can afford, if it's even in your county or in your state where you're from or in your part of the country. So we really need to be ramping up the supply of housing so that there's places for people to go. So all this to say, we can't challenge the systems and at the same time keep people trapped in those systems, right? So it's really hard to say that we're going to challenge the shadow monsters, if you will, of healthcare and housing and systemic racism and all of that. But continue to make decisions in our businesses and our daily lives that make it hard for people to remain housed, whether that's the wages that we pay, whether that's the way that we view animals as a part of the family, where a family might have to relinquish an animal because they can't afford the vet care or the medical care. So it's really a challenge to us to shift our thinking into maintaining and preserving families and doing what we can to offset the systems that we know are contributing directly to the crisis we see. This is just a brief overview because I think it's really critical to understand trauma and how trauma plays into not only people who are experiencing homelessness, but people who are at risk or at lower income in general and what that does to you. So trauma basically is defined as an event or circumstance resulting in physical harm, emotional harm, or life-threatening harm. It's an event that has a lasting adverse effect on mental health, physical health, emotional health, social well-being, or spiritual well-being. And I think it's fair to say that most people will experience some form of trauma in their life. There's a lot of ways that trauma shows up. So what that means is, especially for people who are unhoused, they've experienced a lot of trauma, likely to get to the point where they are that they have nowhere else to go and no relationships to fall back on. But they also are actively experiencing trauma because they don't have their fundamental needs of psychological, physiological safety met. They don't have shelter even. So the way that we engage with people is in a trauma-informed way to make sure that we're not causing that trauma that they're already experiencing to be exacerbated unnecessarily. And the first step in trauma-informed care is safety. So making sure people feel safe where they are, whether that's physically or emotionally. And that alone can be a really hard thing to do depending on the situation that people are in. But being trustworthy and transparent is important. We see all the time where people make false promises because you see somebody in a situation or you see an animal in a shelter and you really want to make it better. And so you promise that, X, Y, and Z is going to happen because you really mean it and you believe it, but it doesn't come to fruition. And so the more that happens for people who are unhoused, the harder it is for them to trust the system and the people trying to help them. So being transparent and open with them is always the better approach compared to trying to sugarcoat or make a promise that we don't know we can keep. We also know that peer support is really important. It's one thing for me to talk to somebody who's unhoused and help guide them through the resources available and what we can do to support. It's another thing to talk to somebody who either is or has experienced homelessness and has literally been in that exact same spot. And it really goes beyond that. It goes into engaging with folks who have experienced housing insecurity, housing crises, homelessness, and putting them at the decision table to say, I think we know based on science and evidence and what we've learned that this is the best way to address this problem, but what do I really know? I've never been unhoused. And so making sure those people's voices, their experiences, their pain is all lifted up and that they have a voice, not only in their own path, but in designing the systems that we're trying to build that will get them back into housing and letting that input be heard and actually valued. Collaborations, that means collaboration across all of the safety net systems. When I was in LA, we found that about 90% of adults who were unhoused in LA County had prior interaction with some county system. So whether it was mental health, physical health, foster care. So what it tells us is that we know the people who are falling through, we know who they are because they've been in our safety net systems before. So we need, as a system, we need to be able to work together to prevent that from happening in the first place and to catch those people before they hit rock bottom. Empowerment is huge and making sure that people have a voice and the autonomy to make decisions. There's a lot of times that we think we know best and we can be the boss of somebody else's life. But even if it's a decision we don't agree with, you have to empower people to make their own choices and respect that because ultimately it's their decision and they're the ones who get to go down that path. And that's a really personal choice for them. And then, of course, cultural and historical context is important as well, where people are coming from, who they are, the areas they were raised in, their race, ethnicity, gender, any sort of background that's important. So you make them feel seen, that you're trying to actually hear, and you're not treating them as sort of another widget in the system that is being passed along. So all of these elements are core components of trauma-informed care, and they don't just apply to the unhoused population. They apply to the healthcare system. They apply to how we treat parents, pet parents who are coming in to either adopt or to relinquish a pet. All of these things matter in making sure that we have the most authentic form of communication with folks and that we're respecting choices and we're respecting the autonomy of the individuals, even if sometimes we don't agree with them. This is just a quick study, which I'm sure many of you have seen, but there's been a lot of work looking at the human-animal bond. And I think we know that human-animal bond is so critical. I can't tell you the number of times that I would go out with our teams in Los Angeles and they would have folks who are unhoused in encampments and would never talk to anybody. But if you started talking about their dog, or if you brought a pet treat, or if you brought some vet care, wow, did that cause the person to open up? Because these animals, for so many of these people, are their entire family and lifeline. So I think it's really important to understand that bond if we're really going to reach some of those people that truly do need help as well. And you'll see the numbers here. This is an international survey, actually, but 95% of people consider their pet a part of their family. 90% say they have a close relationship with their pet. 76% say they would make major life changes for their pet if necessary. So there's no question that people believe and really feel that pets are a part of their family. And despite all of that, because of, I think, the economic crises, because of what we're seeing in in finance and employment, we are seeing higher and higher numbers of animals being surrendered because of human-caused problems, right? So it's not necessarily because of the bad behavior, the dog doesn't go to the bathroom, goes to the bathroom in the house and I don't like it. In fact, over 30% of these top reasons that dogs and cats are surrendered is because they have a housing crisis, they had a family change, like a caretaker change or a death, or they can't afford it. And sure, those other reasons still exist, but I think it's really important to recognize this 30% of people who, even though that human-animal bond is real, are forced to make no other choice but relinquish their pet. And what role do we have to play in actually supporting them in keeping the families together, or in just using a trauma-informed lens to be compassionate, empathetic, and understanding, even if on the face of it, we might not fully understand why the decision is being made. So if you don't want to change direction, you may end up where you're heading. And so what we really have moving forward are two options, right? Option one is we can blame people. These are some of the things that I've seen on social media. I'm sure you've heard all these things, that I would rather be homeless than surrender my pet. If you're too poor to afford vet care, you shouldn't have a pet. You see some clips here blaming the owner, making it really hard to actually get an animal. I'm sure many of you have heard things similar to this that exist, but hopefully what we've even just seen here is that blaming the people is not going to solve the problem, and instead really using trauma-informed approaches. I love this screenshot. This is from Lexington, and they had this Frenchie that got tied up at the gate. They did the whole thing, and at the end, they did a call out to the person who left the Frenchie there and said, we want to help you if you need to surrender your pet or if you need access to care. They chose a path of, no, we're going to try to reach the people and keep these families together and not bring judgment onto these folks, right? We're going to recognize them as a part of our community. So it goes back to the best way to support pets is to care for the people who love them, and at all costs, preventing animals from coming into the shelter and keeping those families together. These are just a few of the ways that you could get started immediately. If you're on the animal welfare side, you can partner with your local homeless services provider to really help design animal inclusive supports, whether that's homeless shelters or food banks, helping those two systems talk to each other. It's something Allison and I were starting to do in LA when I was there, but there's so much work to be done and a lot of things that can be learned from those two systems talking. All of us should move from being to be curious and not judgmental, really checking ourselves and making sure that we're coming with curiosity first, instead of judging people and accusing them of being bad people when we don't understand the situation. Keeping pets and their families together, of course. Cross-training human services and animal staff is so huge. I started training our outreach workers in LA, how to scan for microchips, for example. There's just a lot of things that we can do to be force multipliers for each other and to understand both sides. And that's also, following the adoption protocols in the Adopters Welcome. If you haven't read that from the Humane Society, please do. And safety net fostering program. So if someone has no other choice, they have to go to the hospital, but they don't want to leave their pet, there is a safety net fostering option for them to hold their animal for a couple of weeks while they get done whatever they need to have done in their life. And we have some flexibility there. And I put some resources in here that you are welcome to see. I love the blog that Shannon Glenn wrote, Animal Welfare Has a Cruelty to People Problem, talks more about this trauma-informed lens. You can go and you can see the rental research dashboard to show how limiting our housing options are already. But then if you add on top of it our pet-friendly policies or lack thereof, it's very, very minimal. So just more things for you to learn. Also, you can reach out to me and I'd be happy to talk about it as well. And that is the summary for me, Allison. I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you so much, Heidi. That's so incredible. And I love the way that you use the shadow monster and then also the faucet to really visualize the problem and how it exists. Lots of questions. We have time for one. And this one I think is really interesting. For those that are primarily in an animal shelter environment, I'm going to back up because I think we'll have some other topics today that talks about having social workers on staff, which is very important. But I would love for you to answer this one. Could you speak a bit more about specific language to use to avoid triggering a person with trauma? With the best intentions in the world, we've been so socialized, colonized into using certain vocabulary that we might not, yes, we might create harm unintentionally.
Mhm. I think that the best thing you can do when you're talking to somebody in these situations is prioritize listening over talking or providing the answers and solutions. And when in doubt, ask questions rather than making statements. And I think that people are pretty good at speaking for themselves about what they need. And oftentimes, and we've all been guilty of it, right? Oftentimes we're just like too much in a rush because we have something else to do, or there's a line out the door, or there's 1,000 other things happening. And so we're trying to get to the answer. But when in doubt, take the time to ask the questions in the best way that you can and give the person the time to provide the answer that's the truest to them.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Thank you for your leadership in the homeless services world and now in the animal welfare world. We're really fortunate to have you.